I opened my eyes to a world that did not belong to me, soaked in a darkness so thick I could almost taste it. My heart thundered, a dull thud in my ears, and the edges of my vision felt smudged. I was lying on something cold, wooden boards, maybe. The stench of stale air and rot coiled in my nostrils, mingled with a faint chemical odor I couldn't name. The pain at the back of my skull was a throbbing, urgent thing, and my mouth felt like I'd swallowed nails. Slowly I pushed upright, my bones stiff, my muscles screaming. The heavy blackness shifted as my eyes adjusted, revealing only vaguely the shape of walls around me. My fingertips grazed the floor, rough wooden planks, splintering. Each breath came shallow, as if the space itself tried to choke me. I had no memory of how I ended up here. The last thing I distinctly remembered was at a bar. No, maybe driving home. My thoughts tangled. Something must have happened. I forced myself up onto my knees. That was when I first heard the moan, an undercurrent of metal groaning, or maybe an old house settling. A sinister hush. Suddenly a rasping sound somewhere overhead, like nails scraping across a wooden surface. I froze. My heart hammered so violently I felt dizzy. There was no immediate explanation for that noise, no context for where I was, or who had brought me. But the realization I was not alone settled in my stomach like rancid acid. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the oppressive dimness. The walls, if they were walls, seemed aged, maybe wooden with random patches of discolored wallpaper. A single door shape glimmered faintly across the room. At least, I guessed it was a door, the faintest crack of something less dark than the rest, suggesting a boundary. My body shook with adrenaline. I crawled forward, uncertain if my legs would hold me. The boards under my palms felt warped, some nails protruding. One slip might tear my skin, but I couldn't remain in that corner. The air reeked of dampness and something else, something reminiscent of old sewage or decaying matter. My tongue tasted bitter fear. Every inch closer to that door felt infinite. My heartbeat hammered in my skull. Then a new sound froze me, footsteps overhead, slow, deliberate. The squeak of wood as weight shifted from one foot to another. A corridor or a second floor. The pattern was impossibly measured, as though each step was taken with calm purpose. There was a presence up there, pacing. A wave of panic crashed into me. I felt like an animal trapped in a cage. I had to get out, had to find a way. My throat was so dry that swallowing hurt, but I forced down the panic. I reached the supposed door. It had no knob from this side. Just a rectangular outline in the gloom. I pressed a shaking hand against it, rough, chipped paint under my fingers. My pulse soared as I realized there was no handle, no lock mechanism from within. Silence reigned overhead for a moment, and I let out a shaky exhale. Maybe the occupant had moved away. Perhaps they wouldn't realize I was awake, or so I hoped. I pressed lightly on the door, gently pushing with my fingertips. It gave about half an inch, then stuck. Possibly latched or blocked from the outside. My mind reeled. There must be some other exit, or a hidden window. I turned, scanning the walls. The darkness was near absolute, only a faint suggestion of shapes. Then I noticed something far to the left, a slight reflection, maybe metal catching an unseen glow. Cautiously, I edged toward it. The boards creaked beneath me. My breath caught every time the wood groaned, terrified I might alert whoever else lived here. As I neared that glint, the smell intensified, coppery, sour, reminiscent of old blood. My stomach churned. My trembling hand extended, and my fingertips brushed something cold and damp. I recoiled. The faint reflection came from a chain looped around what felt like an iron ring hammered into the plank floor. A large, dark stain spread around it, sticky in places. Dread pulsed in my veins. I didn't dare guess what fluid that might be. Footsteps upstairs resumed. Closer now. They passed overhead, descending a set of stairs, clack, 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 each step slow and measured. My blood ran cold. My mind screamed, hide. But hide where? The only furniture I sensed was a battered wooden crate in a corner, or I might wedge myself in the gloom behind some junk. But every second was precious. I found a small recess near one wall, half behind a leaning stack of musty boxes. My legs almost gave out as I crouched there, trying not to breathe audibly. My heart hammered so loudly I feared it might be heard through the floor. The footsteps approached the door from the other side. I heard a faint scraping of metal. Then a click. My entire being tensed. The door that had no handle from inside was being unlocked from the outside. I forced my hand over my mouth to stifle a panicked gasp. The doorknob turned, an invisible knob from my vantage. The door eased inward with a whisper of hinges. Light spilled in, a weak, sickly glow, perhaps from a single bulb in the corridor beyond. Enough to reveal the stained wooden floor, the chain bolted to that ring, the battered crate, and me, crouched just out of the direct line of sight behind a dusty box stack. I pressed myself as far back as possible, praying the darkness concealed me. A shape stood in the doorway. Tall, lean, wearing something that might have been an old apron or a tattered coat. Hard to see. The stench that accompanied him was sharper now, like a mixture of sweat, old meat, and antiseptic chemicals. My eyes fixated on his silhouette, and I realized he held something slender in his left hand, maybe a long piece of metal or a rod. Slowly, he stepped into the room. I couldn't breathe. My lungs burned from the effort of staying silent. The man's footsteps were as slow and deliberate as those I'd heard above. He paused near the chain and knelt. I heard the clink of metal as he inspected it. Then a low grunt, almost disappointed. My stomach twisted. Was he expecting to find me chained there, unconscious? If so, he must realize I was free. My mouth went dry. He rose again, scanning the gloom. From my vantage, I caught a fleeting glimpse of his face, thin, eyes sunken in dark sockets, hair shaved close to the scalp. The eyes flicked with a predatory glint, searching. My heart hammered so loud I was certain he'd hear it. "Where are you?" he muttered, voice a gravelly whisper that made goosebumps rise on my arms. He took another step forward, turning slightly, the light from the corridor illuminating a portion of his face. I saw pale skin, mottled with scars or lumps I couldn't define from this distance, and dried flecks of something on his apron. The rod in his hand glinted, slender, maybe a prod or metal pipe. I clenched my teeth against the wave of nausea. Fear threatened to strangle me. He advanced further, scanning the corners. Each step accentuated the dryness in my mouth and the pounding in my skull. My leg muscles screamed from crouching behind the boxes, but I didn't dare shift. If he came just a foot closer, he might spot me. He let out a hiss of frustration. Then, slowly, he retraced his steps to the door. But before stepping out, he paused, turned, and I caught a glimpse of his lips parted in a smile, a chilling curve that reeked of sadism. As though he took pleasure in the idea I might be cowering somewhere. I fought a shiver. In that moment, he spoke again, this time more distinctly, "I'll find you eventually. No reason to hide. We are going to have some fun." Then he laughed, a low, hollow chuckle that reverberated off the damp walls. My skin crawled. The door closed with a subtle thud, and I heard the metallic scraping as he locked it from outside. I didn't move for a long minute. My body felt paralyzed by tension. Finally, I allowed myself a ragged exhale. He hadn't seen me, or so it seemed. But how long until he returned? If he discovered me free, would he bring heavier restraints? I forced my shaky limbs to stand. My entire body ached, but I had to try the door again, now that it was momentarily unlocked, except, no, I'd heard him relock it as he left. Maybe I could pick it. But there was no handle or keyhole from inside. The door was solid wood, likely thick. The chain on the floor gave me no illusions. This place was a personal cell for victims. My heartbeat hammered at the thought. I had to find another way. Gathering what nerve I had, tripping over my own feet, "Eu miraste," no, I reminded myself to speak English in my thoughts, keep them coherent. I'd apparently been drugged or something. My mind was playing language games. Focus. I scoured the corners. The boxes were old, rotted. One contained a pile of newspapers so moldy they disintegrated to the touch. Another had random scraps of cloth that reeked of stale sweat. The third was empty except for a filthy rag. No tools or anything. The walls, however, might hold a clue. My fingertips brushed along the boards, looking for a seam or a hidden panel. All the while, I felt an urgent ticking clock. He might come back at any second. 100 heartbeats later, I'd found no window, no vent, no gap big enough. The boards overhead looked sturdy. The entire space was some kind of makeshift cellar or room with no easy exit. My eyes burned with unshed tears. I was stuck in a nightmare. Then I noticed something beneath the crate, a faint notch in the floor that might be a trapdoor. My pulse leaped. Carefully, I shoved the crate aside. Indeed, there was a slight rectangular outline in the boards. A possible hatch. My heart soared. Maybe I could hide there or find a route out. But when I tried to pry it open, it wouldn't budge. The edges felt sealed or locked from below. Or maybe it was just swollen from moisture. I tried using a broken piece of wood to wedge it, but it only chipped splinters. Frustration overwhelmed me. The footsteps above returned, pacing. I froze, half expecting him to barge in. But after a few minutes, the footsteps receded. He was still there, drifting through the house, maybe waiting for me to make a noise. I noticed I'd started shaking uncontrollably. My stomach churned with hunger and anxiety, my head pounded from thirst and tension. If I was going to survive, I needed to keep calm. I had to fight. Time slipped. Could have been minutes or hours. The overhead footsteps came and went, sometimes accompanied by a dragging noise. Occasionally I'd hear a scrape or a door squeal. Once, a faint moaning that might have come from somewhere else in the house. Another prisoner. The thought made me sick. Eventually, I mustered the courage to check that door again. I pressed my ear against it. No immediate footsteps. Perhaps he was on the other side of the house. The door was definitely locked. I felt the seam, solid, no easy way to force it. The hinge pins, maybe, but from inside they were hidden or hammered flush into the wood. If only I had a crowbar or real tool. I stepped back, gaze roving the gloom. That chain with the ring. Could I do anything with it? The ring was anchored deep in the floor. The chain length was about 3 feet, with a shackle on one end. Possibly used to restrain ankles or wrists. My stomach lurched at the mental image. But the chain itself might be used as a weapon or a lever. I gripped the chain, testing its sturdiness. It wouldn't pull free easily. But I realized if I looped it around something to get more torque, maybe I could pry up some boards. The notion was desperate. Each second I spent made me sweat more, anticipating the maniac's return. But I had to act. Hooking the chain around a gap in the floor near the trapdoor, I tried to get leverage. My arm strained, the metal bit into my palms. A quiet squeal of wood gave me hope. But after a minute, the board barely shifted. I had no mechanical advantage, and the ring felt unmovable. Curses hissed from my lips. I was wasting energy. Another approach then. Maybe the boxes, could I stack them to reach the ceiling? But the ceiling was just more boards, presumably the underside of the ground floor. I had no idea how thick. Sweat dripped down my brow. My entire body trembled from the effort of not losing it. I pictured my captor's face. That grin. The iron rod. The chain. He had planned something horrifying for me, clearly. People like him. My mind conjured images of grim tabloid stories, hidden dungeons, victims tortured for weeks. My chest tightened. No, I wouldn't let that happen. I'd do anything to escape. My eyes fell on the battered crate again. It was heavier than the rotted boxes, a thick wood. If I used it as a ram, perhaps I could strike the door from inside. But the door seemed robust. Still, maybe if I slammed repeatedly. The risk was immense. I'd create noise. He would come. But if it burst open, I'd have a chance. Indecision paralyzed me. The repeated footsteps overhead paused again, then resumed. My mind whispered, if you do this, he'll come. If the door doesn't give, he'll put you in chains and do unspeakable things. But if I don't do it, I'm just waiting to be captured anyway. I closed my eyes, inhaled shakily, and decided. I'd do a quick test, see if the door had any give. If it held fast, I'd abort. Summoning what strength I had, I appended the crate, angled it near the door. Then I pressed my back against the far wall and dashed forward, slamming the crate corner into the door. The impact jarred my arms, reverberated through my bones, and the door rattled but didn't fly open. A noise echoed, far too loud. My heart leaped into my throat. I strained to hear. Footsteps overhead quickened. He must have heard that. I had no time. With a surge of adrenaline, I rammed the crate a second time. The door shuddered, a small crack forming near the top hinge. But the lock area seemed intact. Footsteps were pounding down the hallway overhead. He was coming. Panic soared in me. Another blow might break the hinge. But I might not have time. My arms ached. Could I hide again? He definitely heard. No, if he found me with the crate, I'd be finished. My only shot was to keep ramming, hoping the door would yield. I took a breath, flung my full weight behind the crate for a third strike. The corner dug into the door near that weakened hinge. With a splintering crunch, the hinge gave way partially. I felt a surge of triumph. Then the doorknob from the outside rattled. He was unlocking it. A jolt of terror shot through me. The door was locked, yes, but I'd compromised the hinge. I heard him bark something guttural, cursing. The lock clicked. The door stuck, half off its hinge. Summoning everything, I bashed the crate one final time. A chunk of wood parted from the jamb. The door jerked outward, tearing from the top hinge with a shriek of nails. The man behind it gave a startled yell. I lunged forward, slamming my shoulder into the splintered door. It flew open enough for me to see him, shock in those sunken eyes. He brandished the rod or pipe. Our gazes locked, adrenaline blazing in my veins. I didn't wait. I crashed the crate forward, smashing into his midsection. He grunted, doubling over, but his hand lashed out, the rod scraping along my arm. I yelped in pain as it tore my skin. Warm blood trickled, but I forced the crate at him again. He stumbled back into a dim corridor. A bare bulb overhead cast flickering shadows on stained walls. My head spun from the surge of violence, but I had to keep going. I saw a staircase behind him leading up. Another door to the left. Possibly a path out. The maniac was half-crouched, spitting curses, trying to swing the metal bar at my legs. I jumped back just in time, nearly losing my footing on the threshold. The corridor floor was old linoleum, cracked and filthy. I stepped sideways, bracing for another attack. The man rose to his full height. He was tall, a foot taller than me. His eyes glowed with rage. I glimpsed the tattered apron, dark patches that might be dried blood. The reek turned my stomach. My grip on the crate faltered, it was unwieldy. He advanced, brandishing the rod. Desperation flared. I flung the crate at him, forcing him to parry with the rod. The wooden crate smashed partially, board snapping. It gave me a split-second advantage. I lunged past him, bolting toward the door at the end of the corridor. My shoe skidded on something sticky. He roared, twisting around, swinging the rod. It missed my head by inches. My pulse hammered. The handle of the corridor door turned in my grip, but it was locked. I let out a ragged sob. This place was a labyrinth of locked exits. He lunged behind me, grabbing my shirt. I spun, tearing free. The rod whipped by me, scraping my ribs. Pain shot through me. I shoved him with my elbows, a savage, clumsy move. We both nearly fell. My chest heaved, panic fueling me. Up the stairs, maybe. That was the only open route I saw. I dashed for the staircase. He was right on my heels, breathing like a beast. My feet pounded each step, the banister shaky. The stench grew stronger up here, some acrid chemical smell. My head reeled. Another corridor at the top, lit by a single flickering bulb, walls lined with peeling wallpaper. 4 doors. Could one lead outside? Or was I moving deeper into his domain? But I had no choice. At the top landing, I turned left to the nearest door. No time to think. I twisted the knob. It opened, unlocked. My heart soared. I slipped inside, slammed it shut, and flicked a small metal latch I spotted. Immediately, he banged the door from outside. The room was a bedroom-turned-charnel house. A battered bed frame, stained mattress, rusted clamps at the corners. My stomach lurched at the suggestion. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with jars of nameless substances, shards of bone. Bits of flesh in murky fluid. My mind rebelled at the reality. The walls were scrawled with symbols, random scribbles in something brownish. My breath caught. He hammered the door, screaming curses. The latch rattled. Time was short. A single window near the far wall, dirty glass, mostly boarded up from the outside, but maybe there was a gap. I rushed to it, half gagging at the reek of old gore. The boards outside pinned the window from the exterior. I yanked anyway, but it was firm. The glass itself was dusty, set in a rotten frame. Could I break it? Possibly. But I'd need force. Behind me, the door splintered as he pounded. The hinge started giving. If I tried to break the window with my bare fists, I'd slash my arms. But there on a shelf, a large glass jar. I grabbed it, ignoring the squishy lumps inside, and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered with a crash, shards and foul liquid spraying. The boards behind still blocked a portion, but I'd created an opening large enough to push. He burst into the room, nearly toppling. I glimpsed his face contorted in insane fury. The rod in his hand glistened with spatters. He lunged, swinging. I dropped to the floor. The rod smacked the side of the bed with a metallic clang. He pivoted, raised it again. My pulse thundered. On the floor, I spotted a piece of broken jar glass, sharp as a dagger. I scooped it, ignoring the sting as it bit my palm. As he brought the rod down, I rolled away. The rod slammed the floor, splintering boards. With a desperate cry, I slashed at his leg with the shard. He howled, blood soaking his pant leg. Anger flared in his eyes. He kicked my wrist. Pain exploded, the shard flew from my grip. I scrambled back, tasting blood in my mouth. My only chance was the broken window. If I could get through the jagged gap, boards or no boards. He advanced, wincing from the leg wound, but still menacing. My eyes darted to the bed, it had a metal pole as a headboard. Could I rip it off as a weapon? Probably no time. He lunged once more, rod overhead. I kicked upward, a clumsy blow at his knee. He stumbled, cursing, crashing into the corner shelves. Jars toppled, smashed. A stench of rotting matter soared. He roared in frustration. This was my moment. I dashed to the window, ignoring the shards jutting out. The gap was maybe a foot wide. If the boards outside had a slight space, I might squeeze. The maniac roared behind me. Without thinking, I forced my torso through the shattered glass frame. My shoulders scraped raw on broken edges, slicing my skin. Pain burned, but I kept pushing. The boards outside angled, there was a wedge of space. I squirmed, ignoring blood oozing from my arms and chest. He seized my ankle, yanking me back. I clutched the outside board, screaming. With a final convulsion, I kicked backward, my foot connecting with his face or chest. He let out a guttural cry, releasing me for a split second. That was all I needed. I shoved forward, half falling out the window onto a small slanted rooftop awning. Fresh air slapped my face. A moan of relief tore from my lips, though I was still not safe. The roof was steep, maybe part of a porch extension. My body slid. I tried to stabilize, scrambled for friction. Inside the bedroom, the maniac hammered the window frame, cursing me. His arm tried to reach out, but the boards blocked him from leaning fully. I saw his face contorted with hatred in the gloom. I half-crawled, half-slid to the roof's edge. Below was maybe a 10-foot drop onto weeds or dirt. The yard, if it was a yard, looked overgrown, ringed by a tall fence. In the faint moonlight, I glimpsed random junk piles. My heart pounded with new urgency. Even if I jumped, I'd still be inside some enclosed yard. But I had no choice. He started removing boards from inside, wanting to clamber out. No time to search for a gentle slope. I slid to the edge and let myself drop. Pain flared in my ankles as I landed on an uneven patch. I collapsed in tall weeds. My vision swam. But I forced myself upright. My clothes were sticky with blood and filth, my arms stung from glass lacerations. Ahead lay a gate in the fence, locked by a chain. I stumbled, scanning frantically. The yard was a junkyard of random items, an old van on cinder blocks, piles of scrap metal, rotting planks. Maybe I could climb the fence. It was tall, about 8 feet, topped with wire. My arms were trembling, but I'd try. A crash behind me. I twisted to see him bounding from the roof, landing heavily, letting out a snarl as he half fell. He turned eyes on me, raising that rod. Even in the moonlight, I saw blood dripping from his calf where I'd slashed him. He advanced, limping but determined. I had seconds. I dashed to the fence. My fingers gripped the chain link. My arm screamed in protest. My raw palm slipped. The fence rattled. I got a foot in a run, hauling upward. The man stumbled over a pile of scrap, but he was closing in fast. Halfway up, I felt the fence start to lean. Rusted at the base, perhaps. But I kept climbing, ignoring how the metal bit into my cuts. Another foot up. The top was ringed with barbed wire spirals. I'd have to push past it. The man lunged for me, but I was just out of reach. He roared, slamming the rod into the fence. It vibrated, nearly dislodging me. I grit my teeth. One hand at a time, I reached the top, the barbed wire glinting wickedly. My arms bled, but adrenaline overcame the pain. I forced my body over the wire, feeling spikes tear my shirt, slash my waist. I stifled a scream. Then I toppled over, plummeting about 2 feet to the other side. My landing was hard, but the ground there was slightly lower. I collapsed, battered, tasting dirt in my mouth. The man pounded the fence, trying to climb, but it trembled precariously beneath him. He cursed, stepping back, as if to find another route. I forced myself up, staggering. I was in an alley behind the property. Or maybe a narrow dirt lane. My surroundings were mostly darkness. Dim shapes of other fences or backyards. No immediate sign of help or a street light. My breath came in ragged sobs, exhaustion threatening to drop me. But I couldn't stop. I heard him shouting on the other side, banging. Possibly he had a gate that opened to the alley. I'd be a sitting duck if I lingered. So I ran. Or rather, limped painfully, each step an agony in my ankles and cut arms. The alley stretched into shadows. I glimpsed a shape of a faint street lamp if I kept going. My heart soared with a flicker of hope. If I reached a road, flagged down a car or found a house with lights, I'd be safe. I had to keep moving. Each yard or fence I passed looked deserted, silent. Overgrown weeds, no barking dogs, no lights. A hush that felt unnatural. The entire area, how remote was it? My footfalls echoed in the night hush. My chest burned. I risked one glance back, no sign of him, but I heard a clang. Maybe he was scaling the fence at a different spot. I pressed on, ignoring the pain. Finally, I emerged onto a dilapidated road, barely paved, with old street lamps spaced wide. Most were dead. One flickered about half a block away. Ruined sidewalk, a few boarded-up houses. My sense of dread was suffocating, as if I'd stepped from one nightmare zone into a bigger ghost town. Still, no time to question. I stumbled in the direction of that flickering lamp. Maybe I'd find a phone booth, a passing car, anything. Blood trickled from the gashes on my arms. My clothes were tattered. If I saw anyone, they'd probably recoil in fear. But I'd beg them for help. Behind me, faint cursing. He was on the street now, maybe 50 yards away. I could see a silhouette in the gloom. My heart lurched. I'd never outrun him if he had a vehicle or if my injuries slowed me further. I pushed harder, panting. As I neared the lamp, I saw a battered sign, Pinewood Avenue. The houses flanking it were dark. Some had broken windows, others looked sagging. This was an abandoned neighborhood. Perfect for a predator to keep victims. My mind reeled. But I couldn't stop. I turned onto Pinewood. The lamp overhead flickered, revealing cracks in the asphalt. A single twisted oak grew by the sidewalk. Then, miracle. A faint glow in an upstairs window of a house on the corner. Possibly inhabited. My battered legs carried me that way. The man's footsteps behind me grew distinct. He was gaining. I forced myself to holler, "Help! Please help!" My voice was hoarse, a rasp. But maybe someone inside that lit house would hear. My blood pounded, terror mingling with a desperate hope. I saw a gate around that corner house. The porch had a small light. I stumbled up the path, ignoring the spike of pain in my shin. I banged on the front door, shouting, "Please, open up, I need help." My voice cracked. My entire body trembled from adrenaline and blood loss. No immediate answer. I hammered again, tears threatening. The man was close, maybe yards away. I could hear him, a hiss of rage. Then a slender glimmer of movement behind me. I risked a glance. Yes, he was limping up the walkway, rod in hand, a savage grin on his face. The door, did it budge? I tried the knob. Locked. I yanked it, hammered again. Anyone inside? Please. My chest heaved in desperation. This was the end if they didn't open. Suddenly, a light flicked on in the hallway behind the door. My heart soared. A shape approached. I heard a chain rattle, a cautious voice, "Who is it?" I stammered, "Please, help me, someone's chasing me." The shape behind the frosted glass hesitated, then slid the chain free. The door opened a crack. A middle-aged woman in pajamas peered out, face pale. She saw my blooded clothes, my frantic eyes. For a heartbeat, I feared she might slam it shut from terror. But behind me, footsteps pounded. She caught sight of the looming figure. Oh dear God, she yanked the door wide. "Come in." I surged forward. The man behind me lunged, but the woman slammed the door in his face. I heard a furious impact as he tried to ram it. She locked it, twisted a deadbolt. "What's happening?" "Who?" "Are you hurt?" she exclaimed, eyes wide. I collapsed onto her foyer floor, choking out, He's a killer, locked me up." I escaped, "Please call the police," my mind spun. Her expression wavered between shock and determination. She nodded, rummaging for her phone. She dialed, breathless, telling me, "Stay calm, I'm calling them right now." Outside, violent pounding on the door. The man shrieked obscenities, rattling the handle. My entire body was on the verge of collapse. The woman spoke rapidly into the phone, "There's a man outside, he's attacking, we have an injured person." Her voice trembled but she forced coherence. I heard sirens, maybe in my imagination at first, but soon they grew real. The pounding on the door ceased. The man, presumably aware that police were near, fled into the night. My vision blurred from relief. The woman hovered, trying to keep me conscious. "They are coming," she said, tears in her eyes. Blue lights flickered through the windows. Muffled voices outside. The door opened cautiously to uniformed officers. I managed to half lift my head, stammering an attempt to describe the house I'd been kept in, or at least the direction. My breath trembled, and darkness threatened the edges of my vision. One officer gently lowered me to the floor, radioing for an ambulance. Another stepped outside with a flashlight, scanning the yard, presumably searching for the attacker. My mind reeled with the insane swirl of events. I'd escaped, battered and traumatized, from that labyrinth. Yet the memory of that man's face, his grin, his torture dungeon, impossible to wipe away. Paramedics arrived. They lifted me onto a stretcher, checking my wounds, shining flashlights in my eyes. I flinched at every abrupt movement, half expecting to see him with the rod. But he was gone. Freed of him physically, though he'd haunt my nightmares. The next hours blurred, the ride to the hospital, bright overhead lamps, stitches for my cuts, intravenous fluids, the beep of machines. Police took statements in hushed tones. I recounted all I could, the basement room, the chain, the attempt to break out. My voice trembled. The lead detective wore a grim expression, promising they'd search the abandoned area. Days later, reading news updates from my hospital bed, I learned they discovered a hidden cellar in that property, plus other horrors. The man, though, was still at large. Some leads indicated he'd used multiple aliases, multiple deserted houses. Possibly he had more victims. My stomach churned with guilt, relief, and terror. Would he come after me again? Did he want revenge? The question loomed. I'd survived. But the scars, both physical and psychological, would remain. Even as the stitches on my arms healed and the deeper bruises on my body began to fade, I woke in cold sweats, hearing the phantom sound of footsteps overhead. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked hollow, eyes ringed with a haunted glint. The man was out there, lurking in shadows, an embodiment of madness. But I had escaped his lair. By some miracle, I had refused to become just another bloodstain on his chain-anchored floor. And though nightmares plagued me, I clung to the knowledge that, in that final, desperate sprint, I had found the will to fight back. In a swirl of horror, I had leapt from that house of nightmares, battered but unbroken. I no longer felt wholly safe anywhere. Even a gentle knock on a door triggered a spike of panic. But I vowed that if they ever caught him, I'd stand up in court, testify, do whatever it took to ensure he never locked another soul in that vile room. Maybe I'd never truly quell the terror inside me, but I'd harness it as determination. Because living with fear, albeit paralyzing, was still living. And I'd wrested that life from his monstrous grip. That was my victory, and it would have to be enough. I left the hospital with a mixture of exhaustion and lingering dread that clung to every cell in my body. 2 weeks had passed since my escape from that nightmare, and the doctors finally deemed me stable enough to go home, though home felt like an alien concept. My injuries, deep cuts on my arms, bruised ribs, the twisted ankle, were healing, but at night I still woke in panic tremors, drenched in sweat, hearing in my dreams the slam of a metal rod or the scraping of chains on a wooden floor. The detective assigned to my case, a patient but perpetually tired-looking man named Price, gave me a lift from the hospital to my small apartment in the next county. The drive was subdued, occasional traffic passing in the early evening gloom, the swirl of headlights. Price asked routine questions, verifying details of what I'd told him already. Did I recall any distinct smell besides the rot? Did I notice the shape of the front yard, the style of the fence? The color of the doorknob? I offered anything I could, though so much was hazy. I'd been half-drugged or in shock at times. Still, he pressed, desperate for a lead. I peered out the window, the passing lights reflecting on the glass. My reflection stared back, gaunt, eyes ringed by shadows. A shell of my old self. After a moment, I turned to Price. "Have you found anything else, like evidence of other victims?" I asked softly, the question tying my stomach in knots. Price's jaw tightened. "We found remains," he admitted. "Forensics are still sorting it out, but it looks like there's a chance multiple people were kept there. Some of the remains are old. Possibly months, maybe years. The property was an abandoned home, no official owner on record. Another building in a similarly abandoned block. We suspect the occupant hopped from house to house. He's quite adept at evading detection." A chill slid down my spine. "So he's still out there?" Price nodded, exhaling. "We are trying. But we haven't pinned down his name. We have a broad physical description from you, plus partial footprints. The locals in that area apparently avoid it, lots of vacant structures, no stable community. It's made it easy for scum like him to operate." His knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. "If you remember anything else, no matter how small, it might help." My throat felt thick. "I'll do my best." Memories flickered, unbidden, his shaved scalp, the scars along his arms, that cunning grin. But they were disjointed images rather than anything truly identifying. My mind had been in survival mode, not memorizing license plates or features. We arrived at my apartment complex, 3 stories of drab brick, rusted railings, a meager parking lot. Price helped me with my meager hospital bag. My neighbor's windows glowed here and there, the faint hum of TV sets. I'd never been so relieved and yet so uneasy to be in a familiar place. The detective lingered by the door. "You have my card," he said gently. "Any sign of trouble, anything suspicious, call me right away. Don't open the door to strangers. If you're up for it, would like you to come by the station tomorrow to look at some mugshots, see if anyone rings a bell." I forced a small nod. "I understand. Thank you." My voice was hoarse. I stepped inside, flicking on the overhead light. The air smelled stale, as if I'd been gone for months, not weeks. The detective gave me a final, concerned look and departed, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Standing there alone in the entryway, I felt a surge of conflicting emotions: relief at not being in that monstrous house, terror that the maniac might find me, guilt for the unknown fates of others less lucky than me. My body trembled. The walls of my apartment, usually so bland and comfortingly normal, felt claustrophobic. My single living room, small kitchenette, short hallway to a bedroom and bath, it all seemed vulnerable, as if he could slip in at any moment. I forced myself to check each window, each lock. My bedroom window latched, the bathroom window latched, door locked. I tested the deadbolt on the front door thrice. Satisfied but still anxious, I sank onto the couch. My side ached from the bruised ribs, so I carefully reclined, eyes drifting to the ceiling. How surreal that just 2 weeks ago, I'd had an ordinary life. Now the smallest creak or shadow made my heart skip. I dozed off in that position, shoe still on, haunted by half-dreams. Sometime later, maybe an hour, my phone's ring jarred me fully awake. Heart racing, I fumbled for it. The clock read 11:12 p.m. The caller ID was unknown. My stomach twisted. Could it be Price? Or a spam call? Or someone else? My pulse hammered. Slowly, I answered, breath shaky. Hello. A moment of silence crackled on the line. Then breathing. My chest constricted. I whispered a second greeting. The breathing continued, almost a rasp. Then a click, and the line went dead. My body broke into tremors. Was it him? Or maybe just a random telemarketer? But that breath, it felt too pointed, too malicious. I sank forward, clutching the phone. Don't panic, I told myself. He can't possibly have your number, can he? But a voice inside me whispered, he's cunning, you saw how methodical he was. Fear gnawed at my gut. I texted Detective Price, letting him know I'd gotten a suspicious call. He responded quickly, we'll check with your phone carrier. Keep me updated. If you get any more calls, try to record them. That offered little comfort, but at least I wasn't alone in the suspicion. I spent the night in a swirl of half-sleep, every noise magnified. Once, I startled awake, convinced I'd heard that rod scraping on the outside of my door. But no, the hallway was empty. Sometime near dawn, I drifted into an exhausted slumber. The next morning, a pale dawn light illuminated my cramped living room. I woke with stiff muscles and a headache. The dream images were already fading, an endless corridor, a door with no handle, a chain dragging behind me. My chest was damp with sweat. I forced myself upright. Time to face the day. I'd promised I'd go to the police station. That was priority. Showering was an ordeal. The water stung the healing cuts and the steam conjured the memory of rancid warmth from that basement. I clamped my eyes shut, breathing slowly, telling myself I was safe. The scalding water felt both cleansing and punishing. Afterward, I wrapped fresh bandages around my arms. The deeper slash near my ribs had staples, so I was extra careful. The reflection in the mirror revealed a haggard figure. I hardly recognized the timid expression. But there was nothing to do but push forward. Outside, the sun brightened a clear sky. The crisp air almost invigorated me, though my steps carried an undercurrent of tension. My car, an older sedan, sat dusty in the parking lot. I checked it thoroughly for any sign of tampering before getting in, my new normal, apparently. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. The radio was silent static. Usually, I'd put on music, but now I just craved quiet. I'd had enough mental noise for a lifetime. At the precinct, I was greeted by Price, who escorted me to a small, bleak office lined with file cabinets. A detective I hadn't met introduced herself as Mills. She had kind eyes and a direct manner, and she spread a series of photos across the desk, dozens of mugshots, some color, some black and white, of men with various builds, ages, hair lengths. Take your time, Mills said gently. If any face triggers recognition, let us know. Even a partial match might help. My stomach flooded. The memory of his face was so vivid yet intangible, a nightmare shape. I scanned the pages one by one, straining for familiarity, the jawline, the shaved scalp, those sunken eyes. But none matched exactly. Some had a passing resemblance in terms of build, but the eyes were wrong or the scars missing. After nearly an hour, I'd found nothing conclusive. My frustration was palpable. Mills consoled me, "We'll keep searching other records. We have contacts out of state. If he's operating across lines, we might find him eventually." Eventually. That word stung like salt in a wound. I forced a nod. "I want to help any way I can." My voice sounded small. Price patted my shoulder. We discussed filing an official statement. I repeated my story for a typed record. The process took another hour. By the end, I was exhausted mentally, but I'd done what I could. Price walked me out. "We'll keep you updated. Meanwhile, try to rest. Maybe see a therapist about the trauma. The department has resources if you need." I thanked him, grateful but hollow. In the parking lot, the sun was higher, the day startlingly bright, as though mocking the darkness I carried. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart hammered. Could it be him again? With sweaty palms, I opened it. The message read, "I see you. Are you sleeping well?" No signature. My pulse spiked. I quickly showed Price. He frowned, took a screenshot. "We can request a trace, but if he's using a burner phone or an anonymous service, we might not get far," he murmured. "Don't respond, let us handle it." Nerves frayed, I drove home, glancing repeatedly in my rearview mirror. Did a battered pickup behind me look suspicious? Or that black sedan? Paranoia suffused me. The route from the station to my apartment was short, but it felt like a labyrinth. Every intersection seemed pregnant with threat. By the time I parked, my hands were shaking on the wheel. Up the stairs, I fumbled with my keys, scanning the corridor for any sign of movement. The air felt stale again. I locked myself inside, setting the chain lock, then sank onto the floor, pressing my back to the door as if to hold it shut with my body. My phone showed no new messages, but it hardly mattered. The fear had lodged itself in my brain, an unwelcome tenant that wouldn't leave. Time crawled. I tried to distract myself, watch some mindless TV. Nothing stuck, I flicked channels. Infomercials, reruns, nothing overcame the suffocating terror. Eventually I made instant ramen, the first meal I'd had since morning. My appetite was minimal, but I forced the noodles down, reminding myself I needed strength. Around 6 p.m., Detective Price texted, "No luck tracing that text. We'll keep at it. Please be vigilant." My nerves spiked again. Vigilant, like I had a choice. The notion of him prowling out there, watching me, made my chest tight. That evening, exhaustion pulled me into a doze on my couch. This time, the nightmares were sharper. I dreamt I was pinned to that stained mattress in the old bedroom, the man's rod tapping methodically on my chest, the distant chain rattling. I woke in a jolt, tears on my cheeks. The clock read 9 p.m. My apartment was silent. My phone lay on the coffee table, unlit. No messages. In a surge of adrenaline, I decided I needed to do something. I couldn't just rot in fear. Maybe I'd go for a short walk around the block, get fresh air, prove to myself I wasn't a prisoner in my own home. The idea both terrified me and felt necessary. I'd bring my phone, keep an eye out. The city streets were somewhat lit, not an abandoned ghost area. If he tried to approach me here, he'd risk attention. Right? I changed into comfortable shoes, zipped a hoodie over my bandaged arms. Checking the hallway was empty, I stepped out, heart thrumming. The building's corridors smelled of cooking spices, faint laundry detergent. My neighbor's door was cracked open, a faint TV glow inside. I forced a smile if they glanced. Then down the staircase, out the front entrance. Night air kissed my face. The street lights along the sidewalk flickered, but the traffic on the main avenue was a reassuring hum. A small convenience store's neon sign glowed at the corner. I inhaled deeply, telling myself this was normal life. I walked slowly, ignoring the twinge in my ankle. The city was not deserted. Cars passed, a couple strolled. I offered a polite nod. They nodded back, unconcerned. The normalcy was surreal. Halfway around the block, near a dim patch between two streetlights, I paused. Something made me tense up, a presence or a flicker of motion in the corner of my eye. I turned. A figure lurked by a parked car, half overshadowed. My heart pounded. But it could just be someone rummaging in their trunk. My mind was hypervigilant. I forced calm, continuing forward. The figure made no move. Possibly just a neighbor. I exhaled slowly. Still, the tension in my chest wouldn't relent. I decided that was enough fresh air for one night. I turned the corner, briskly heading back. Relief grew as my building's sign came into view. I hurried inside, feeling like I'd escaped a threat that might not even have been real. But the sense of being watched never faded. I repeated this existence for a few days, the psychological war of wanting to carry on with daily life, grocery shopping, picking up a prescription, attempting to watch a movie while a voice inside me shrieked that any stranger might be him in disguise. The police station visits continued, me scanning more photos, none matching exactly. Price grew more concerned each day. The phone calls and texts from unknown numbers came sporadically, each one delivering a shot of adrenaline that left me trembling. Breathing, sniffing, or just dead air. Once a single typed message, "I haven't forgotten you. Miss me?" 3 nights in, I woke at 2 a.m. to a scuttling noise outside my door. At first, I froze, listening. Then it repeated, like a faint scratch or scrape near the threshold. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my heart in my throat. Slowly I approached the door, pressed my ear. The noise had stopped. My phone in the other hand, ready to dial 911. My pulse hammered so loud I could barely hear. Then a soft metallic click. My breath caught. Was someone picking the lock? Fear soared. I made a split-second decision to flick the hallway light switch inside my unit so my silhouette wouldn't appear if he forced the door open in darkness. The bright overhead lamp flooded my living room. My eyes stung at the glare. The scraping resumed. Then abruptly it ceased. Silence. I hovered, every nerve screaming. Another minute passed. My phone clenched in sweaty fingers. Finally, I dared to peek through the peephole, no movement. Should I call the cops? Or maybe it was a random neighbor. But at 2 a.m. That made no sense. Quietly, I unlatched the chain and turned the deadbolt, cracking the door half an inch. My heart hammered. If he was out there, I'd see him. The corridor looked empty except for flickering fluorescent lights. I exhaled in shaky relief. Then my foot brushed something on the floor. A small slip of paper. I bent, retrieving it carefully. A single line scrawled in black marker, "Little bird can't hide in the nest forever." I slammed the door shut, breath hitching in terror. That handwriting might as well have been a venomous snake. Everything about it felt personal, mocking. He'd found me. He'd come to my door while I slept. My knees nearly buckled. I stumbled back, called Price's cell with trembling hands. No immediate answer, so I left a panicked voicemail. Then texted him a photo of the note. Within half an hour, 2 uniformed officers showed up. I let them in, shaking. They examined the corridor, found no sign of forced entry. The note was bagged as evidence. They offered to patrol the area, keep an eye out. I stared at them, wanting more definitive action, but what more could they do if the man had vanished into the night? At dawn, Price came by, looking grave. He felt certain this was the same perp. The MO of psychological torment matched. He promised I'd get increased patrol presence near my building, but suggested I might consider relocating temporarily. He's fixated, Price said grimly. We can't guarantee your safety if he's determined. Relocating. That meant letting him chase me from my home. My stomach churned, but maybe that was wise. The next day, I made phone calls to friends or relatives. I had a cousin in a neighboring state, but we weren't close. Still, it might be an option. Meanwhile, I started packing a small suitcase, just in case. My nerves were on edge, every moment expecting him to lunge out of the shadows. That evening, a brand new wave of dread arrived, a letter in my mailbox. I only checked it because I'd ordered some bandage supplies online. Among the junk mail was a plain envelope, no return address, just my name scrawled on the front. My mind soared with panic as I opened it in my apartment. Inside was a single photograph, me at the grocery store from 2 days prior. The vantage was from behind the produce aisle. My face partially turned, eyes tired. On the back, a note in the same handwriting, "You looked so lost. Let's play hide and seek again." I nearly vomited. The realization he was physically stalking me in public. He had followed me inside a well-lit store. I hadn't noticed, too consumed with fear. The intimate sense of being hunted suffocated me. My chest seized with panic so intense my vision darkened around the edges. I sank to the floor, forcing slow breaths. I dialed Price again, voice cracking as I recounted what I'd found. He told me to hold tight, that an officer would come to collect the photo. Then, in a quieter tone, he said, "I really think you should get out of town for a while. This guy is escalating. We'll keep investigating, but you're in immediate danger." Tears burned my eyes. I'd been fighting to preserve some normalcy, but it was clear the man was fixated on recapturing me or tormenting me, maybe both. My pride warred with survival instincts. But I couldn't keep living like a cornered rat, jumping at every sound. So I stuffed clothes and essentials into a duffel bag that night, blinking back tears at the thought of abandoning my apartment, my bed, my daily routine. The uniformed officer arrived, took the photo, made notes, asked a few questions.